Hello and welcome to part two of lesson two, After Death. This being the second half of the lesson on Sheol. If you have not already, do go back and look. Posted immediately before this video will be the first part of this lesson. Now, the reason this is being posted not only almost a week late, but also in two parts, is you'll notice that this will not be a Zoom class, and there was an abrupt ending to the previous lesson. Reasons for that, well, quite simply, are that the Zoom call cut out. And before you go running off to offer your complaints to Zoom, it was my fault. I had a message about low disk space on my laptop, and I thought I would be fine for the evening, and I wasn't. So I ran out of space on my computer to continue recording. I do save these locally. It's just easier for me to do it that way. But I ran out of recording space, and so the recording cut off shortly after the reading out of Luke chapter 16. So if you have not watched the first major portion, quite frankly, of the class, go and do that now. And then what this will be is really a very, very brief version of what we covered in the latter portion of the class. This is kind of a big topic. It's potentially, earth-shattering is not the right term, but it's counterintuitive to what we've mostly been taught. And so I do also want to open up the possibility for those of you who are viewing the recordings. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer them. If I get enough questions, I might make a supplemental video, or I'll just answer questions one-on-one. So hopefully you have already watched the first portion of the class. Hopefully the third lesson of the After Death class won't have any problems, and the recording will go off without a hitch. We won't have any need for technical difficulty type things going on in that case. But we left off roughly, I'll be honest, I didn't watch the whole recording, I watched just the last couple of minutes before getting into this. We left off roughly with the reading of Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. The story, parable, lesson, whatever you want to call it, probably not a parable, on the rich man and Lazarus. That story of the rich man in torment and Lazarus resting in the bosom of Abraham. And I think the recording cut off immediately as I was going to discuss some of the implications we can draw from the intermittent state, or from this text concerning the intermittent state. And so I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of start there in our recapping that we covered. For one, I do want to re-emphasize this point, that there is a division of the souls. The point of personal judgment, which is actually not something I talked about in that class, but it'll help getting into the next one. The moment of personal judgment takes place at death. And so individuals are separated out at this point. The body goes into the earth, the souls go to Sheol, and then for the believers, they rest in paradise, the bosom of Abraham, where we see Lazarus. And for the unbelievers, they await in torment in prison, or Hades, as it is phrased in the lesson. One point that I want to make about those who are in suffering and torment that actually came up later in the class. We had an extra question and answer portion because it wasn't being recorded, so the class did go rather long. But a great point was brought up. And I don't remember exactly the question, but the way it kind of bears itself out is that Satan is not in Sheol. A couple of important points. We'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in our final class when we talk about the eternal state of souls and all of that good stuff. But contrary to popular belief, or at least popular imagery, Satan is not in charge of hell. We often get this image, right, of Satan and his demons tormenting people in hell while he's sitting on his throne laughing demonically, if you will. That's actually not the scriptural case. In fact, hell, when we do eventually get to what we tend to call hell, or the lake of fire, Gehenna, is primarily and chiefly, properly even, a place of torment for Satan. The fire which never goes out was designed for Satan and his angels. In fact, if there are levels of punishment in the eternal death, then Satan is getting the worst of it. We have no idea. If there are levels, Scripture doesn't speak to that. But to emphasize the point, Satan is not the chief of hell, nor, in fact, is he in Sheol. In fact, I quipped to in answer to this question that I wish he were, because, quite frankly, nothing can be done to make the situation any truly worse for those souls who are in torment or in prison. And if Satan were in Sheol, then he wouldn't be on earth. And that is where Satan is now. It's important for us to remember that Satan is not omnipresent like God. Satan is in one place at one time. He can't be in more than one place at a time. And so if Satan were in Sheol, then he wouldn't be bothering Christians here on earth. Unfortunately, many scriptures bear this out, that Satan is prowling around like a roaring lion on this earth. Defeated lion, but he is looking for those to take with him. And so Satan is not located in Sheol to any extent that we are aware, although, as I mentioned, it might be preferable if he were. So that is all I'd like to say for the class on the state of the souls in torment. Quite frankly, we just don't know very much. God hasn't told us, and I think that's probably for our good. But there is more that we can say about the state of souls in paradise, in the bosom of Abraham. And this is the point in the class where we really dug into quite a few scripture readings. And for the sake of this summary, I'm going to give you the scripture citations, encourage you to pause as I go through, read those citations, and then we can pull some generalized commentary off of them, rather than me going through each and every one of them for this really the summary portion. And so the first thing that we know is that this is kind of a general statement, that Sheol is the abode of departed souls. And so if you haven't quite latched on or accepted that idea that all souls do go to Sheol, we really have, more, but three primary texts for us to look at. The first is Isaiah chapter 38, verse 10, and then 17 through 20. Once again, that's Isaiah chapter 38, verse 10, and then skipping to 17 through 20. This is the prayer of Hezekiah, who's one of the kings of Israel, one of the good kings of Israel. And in it, he, who is a believer, speaks of going down and being dragged into Sheol. And I think we can all agree, certainly the unbelievers go to Sheol. And so these texts identify the fact that even believers the righteous even go to Sheol. Although there is that division. It, again, is really the abode of departed souls. The second citation, which is my personal favorite chapter in the book of Jonah, is Jonah chapter 2. Once again, that's Jonah chapter 2. I encourage you to pause the video and go read that. Jonah chapter 2 is Jonah's prayer, either from the moments before death, before he was swallowed by the fish. I have a personal belief that this might even be a prayer of Jonah from Sheol itself. I think Jonah might be dead when he is praying this prayer, although that I have reasons to believe that, but this isn't a class on Jonah. But this is Jonah speaking of being taken down into Sheol. But more than that, God hearing Jonah even as he is there. That Sheol for the believer is not a place of separation from God, but rather is a place of awaiting salvation. And we'll talk more about that as we continue on here today. Great chapter 2 of Jonah. It's often skipped, which is a real shame. The third passage is the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 25 through 31. Here, Peter, once again, that is Acts chapter 2, verses 25 through 31. Here, Peter is speaking of David, who, even now, even at least when Peter is speaking, is resting in Sheol, awaiting his resurrection. One point that I'm not entirely sure why I put it here in my notes, but I did, so I will bring it up here, is that Sheol, or really any point in this intermittent state, is not purgatory. Purgatory is not a Christian teaching. It, quite frankly, and maybe this will seem strange to you, the discussion of purgatory doesn't really even belong in a conversation of what happens after death, mostly because it doesn't exist. The discussion on purgatory, why it exists in Catholic teaching, and what its role is, and well, why it doesn't exist, other than the fact that it doesn't appear in Scripture in any way, is more appropriately placed into the context of a conversation on justification and then righteousness after justification, which is just beyond the scope of this class. So perhaps we'll talk about it some other time. So the next point, which is a point that has been made but is worth really bearing out, is that there is a division that exists within Sheol. There is a separation of the believers and the unbelievers, with the believers dwelling with Christ in a place of peace, rest. But it's also very important, and then of course the unbelievers dwelling in torment, but we've already talked about them. But although this is the paradise portion of Sheol, the place for the for the believers, let me make sure I get that right, it is a place of peace, rest, extraordinary good, an existence without sin. It's very important that we remember that this is, as one of my professors put it, not the real party. The way one of my professors described this is that the intermittent state, the waiting in paradise, the bosom of Abraham, is like being invited to a very fancy dinner party. And you're waiting in the next room, and hors d'oeuvres are being passed around. They're delicious. It's wonderful. You're talking to all sorts of people. It's a good place to be, but you can smell the meal. You can smell the feast being prepared. Maybe you can even hear plates being set out in the next room, and you're waiting for the feast. You're not there yet. Another professor described the intermittent state as a false summit in hiking. It's good. The view from this false summit is absolutely beautiful, but it's not the true summit. There is another place to go from here. Now, the deliverance from or through resurrection into true life eternal is certain, but it is still a Sheol. This intermittent state is exactly that, an intermittent state. It's a time of waiting. And it may be strange to put because we don't really have a good word for this, but the closest I think our human language gets is that for the believers, it's a time of anxious waiting, almost near impatience, but an anxious waiting and impatient waiting that exists without sin. And what exactly that looks like, I think, is beyond our experiences. And we see this really being bared out in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. Once again, that's Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. I encourage you to pause the video and go read that. In these verses, we see the saints, the martyrs, those who are in this intermittent state, underneath the altar, crying out to God for deliverance, for justification, vindication is a better word than justification, and for the resurrection. And then another point that we should make is that Sheol is a place for the believers. It's a place of deliverance. You can see this in both Psalm 49, verses 14 through 15, as well as Job 14, 13 to 14. We were running out of time, so we didn't even read those texts in the original class. But both of these passages really bear out this sense that although believers might be separated from the body and in Sheol, it's a place of deliverance. There's hope. There is something to come. You can smell the feast being prepared. You can see the true summit, if you will, and you know that you'll make it there. There's no more doubt that exists. Salvation is completely and totally assured. So this really brings us to our conclusion here. And so there are really three main points that I want to bring out about the state of the departed souls in Sheol. And that is that, first of all, point one, souls cannot return from Sheol. This does bring up a discussion of ghosts that some people do see. The very short way to answer is that ghosts don't exist. If you'd like to know the longer answer, come talk to me in person or send me an email. I think it's a very interesting topic, but for the sake of the summary here, we'll leave it at ghosts don't exist. Souls cannot, with only an enormously small exception that we see in Scripture, ghosts do not, or souls rather, do not return to earth once they depart. The second is that the second point is that there's no scriptural reason for us to believe that the souls in the intermittent state have any awareness of the events of earth. I suppose they could, but Scripture is completely silent on that issue, and many of the readings we've even gone over seem to imply that the departed souls are unaware of events on earth. Again, questions on that, feel free to reach out. And then the final point, which is one we've already covered here, is that for those departed souls that are in prison, that are in Hades, there is no hope for conversion. There are some individuals out there that preach a kind of a second chance, an opportunity for conversion during this time in the intermittent state or after death. But Scripture is very clear on this issue that, as I mentioned in the video previous, that death is that point of no return. That once someone has died, their personal judgment has taken place, and the die has been cast. It is a done and settled affair. There is no hope for conversion after death, which may seem harsh to say, but this, as well as all teachings on, as few as they are, on the state of the unbelievers, should really serve as a fire in the hearts and minds of Christians. That time is actually short. People have a limited amount of time to hear and to hear of Christ and to come to faith, and that is during their earthly life. And so we need to not be sitting and resting on our laurels. We do need to instead, we should be, through this and other doctrines, encouraged to bear witness, to make disciples of all nations. But of course, that is a bigger topic for another day. So I hope you will join us, whether live or on the recording, for the third lesson in this series, where we will cover the return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the final judgment and that personal judgment that I've spoken of here today. So I hope you can join us for that class. It certainly will be a good one. Hopefully, we'll send up prayers that there are no more technical difficulties, so there won't be a problem where I have to do a summary again. And certainly, if you have any questions from any of the class, but particularly this latter section, this summary here, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would be happy to hear from you. And so I will leave you there. God's blessings, and I'll see you in the next class.